In any case, it was natural for Orientalists to look for problems in the Quran when it comes to science. And here was an area that yielded very few results, extremely few. Now that's not to say that the Quran doesn't contain many verses that have a bearing on modern knowledge. There are. And some have really caught Muslims' attention for many, many years, and they couldn't even come to a description or an understanding of it. For example, the following verse. I'm only going to give one or two examples of this type. There's a verse in the Quran that says, "Have not the unbelievers beheld?" Look, everybody knows what I'm going to say. "That the heavens and the earth were at one time joined, and then we exploded them apart. And that every living creature is made from water." This type of verse perplexed Muslim commentators for centuries. What's the heaven and the earth were at one time one, and then were exploded apart, and every living creature is made from water? You could imagine the reaction in 7th century Arabia when Muhammad, peace be upon him, stood in the desert climate with he and his companions sweltering under the desert sun, and he said, "And every living creature is made from water." But nonetheless, Muslims today feel they have a better grasp of this verse that refers to nature, than maybe Muslims have who've been befuddled by this verse for many centuries. Because today, they don't insist on this interpretation, but at least it makes more sense to them today, because today they know that every living cell is composed of at least 70% water. To them, the expression that every living creature is made from water now makes sense. Or at least they can make sense of it to themselves. That the heavens and the earth were at one time one, or joined, and then were torn or ripped apart or exploded apart. Many Muslims wonder, well, I mean, lots of people nowadays believe that anyway. Lots of scientists, physicists, they believe in this so-called Big Bang. Maybe that's a reference to that. Maybe we finally understand what the meaning of this verse is. And there's still a few references in the Quran that Muslims are still befuddled by. Still quite can't make sense of. I was reading an article just the other day, not an article, a book, by a Christian author who was writing about, and it was a very beautiful book, about Christians in the Quran. That was the topic. But he just happened to mention in passing, because he knew something about embryology. He says, Muhammad, peace be upon him. He didn't write peace be upon him. He said, Muhammad seemed to have quite an accurate knowledge of human embryology. Because as he describes the development of the fetus in the womb, he gives an extremely accurate description that is quite compatible with 20th century knowledge. So he seems, I think he said the Arabs seem to have quite a good knowledge. But if you study the history of Quran commentary for several centuries, you could see that the Arabs had extremely poor knowledge about human embryology. They really couldn't make sense of a lot of that description. When I was talking about this in Kansas City, I was involved in a dialogue. One of the members of the other panel got quite upset. And he said, yes, okay, fine, but does the Quran say that that all takes place in the womb? I knew what he was getting at. Because lots of times people take their scriptures and interpret their words out of context. They pull an entire passage out of context, assign to certain words meanings that are not naturally there, and then find any theory they like, modern theory. People do it all the time. And so his question was perfectly legitimate. I said, yes, it does say this takes place in the womb, explicitly, in the 22nd surah, from the 5th verse on, I think. But it does. And so that ended the discussion. But in any case, the Quran does have many, many verses that have a bearing on modern knowledge. The signs of the Quran, the natural signs, are repeated again and again and again in so many surahs. Many other examples I could think of, but let's put that aside. The point is, are there contradictions? Muslims in the 20th century have not found any. When this happened to come up in a dialogue in Kansas City, Dr. Dudley Woodbury was on the other side. He was from the Zwemer Institute, and he's a very fine lecturer, by the way, a brilliant explainer of the Christian perspective. And I have a great deal of respect for him. But he felt pressed to be able to produce a counterexample, some example of a conflict with science. And he thought, and he finally got up and he said, there's a verse in the Quran that says that God brings life to the Egyptian farmer's soil by the rains. The rains bring life to the Egyptian soil. I'm not quite sure of the reference he's talking about, but that's what he said. And he said it's not the rains that brings life to the Egyptian farmers' crops and soil. It's the annual floods that take place along the Nile. So the Quran has it wrong. And I was sitting by, but this shows you the sort of arguments that are put forth. This is the only argument I ever heard of that nature. There was one other that I heard. Maybe I have a few seconds to tell you, but that's what he said. The reaction of Dr. Jamal Bedawi, sitting right next to me, who was from Egypt, was surprise. He said, Dr. Woodbury, try telling an Egyptian farmer that he doesn't need rain during the course of his growing season. In a year of drought, there's no crops. And he said, by the way, if you want to be technical about it, what produces the annual floods but the inland rains? But in any case, that shows you sort of how the dialogue takes place. But in any case, honestly, the only two criticisms I've ever known was that one and one other that's of a similar nature and easily ignored. And so the Muslims really don't find that there's any compatibility between the Quran and modern knowledge, at least in these two spheres, inconsistencies and science. And I don't think they ever will.